So Dr. Andy is an ecologist and biochemist who focus on plant ecophysiology and the terrestrial carbon cycle. And he is particularly interested in understanding the effect of environment on the diverse of plant-mediated controls of terrestrial carbon cycling and nitrogen dynamics as limiting nutrients across continuum of human disturbed ecosystem. I'm literally reading from your biography, so I don't make any mistake. He's also an assistant professor in Environmental Scientists Initiative and an assistant professor of geography at Hunter College. This is the brief introduction that I got from your portfolio. So I will let you introduce yourself the way you prefer.
Okay. I mean, you pretty much touched on all the points. I guess, like, broadly, I describe myself as a field ecologist who focuses on forest and urban ecosystems, and the types of questions that we try to answer are related to understanding how global environmental change, so different things that humans do, urbanization, climate change, forest fragmentation, how that alters the way our ecosystems function, how trees grow, structure of forests, and a lot of this at its heart is to just better understand carbon and water cycling in ecosystems, like these important services that we kind of look to for our ecosystems to provide. And I realize in some ways that maybe that's a little bit different than what you all think about with plants being in an ethnobotany group, but I'd be happy to kind of talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've worked on that have some connections to ethnobotany, even if I myself am not an ethnobotanist. But I will say that when I was an undergrad, one of my favorite classes that I took was an ethnobotany class. And for my class project, I had this like fascination with the Adirondack Mountains. This is I don't know where everyone is located. I know there's at least like a couple of different countries represented here, but the Adirondacks is a 6 million acre park, so about 2.5 million hectare park in northern New York. And it's one of the largest parks in the lower 48 of the US. And so what I did for my project was I just looked into all the different ways that indigenous peoples of that region used the plants for a variety of different purposes. And so while I'm not an ethnobotanist, I do have a strong appreciation for all the different ways that humans have and continue to use plants.
Oh, before we start, I like asking this question at the beginning, like just generally before we talk about your field, but what made you choose it? Like you're first, you said that you like ethnobotany. Why did you shift, or why did you choose the specific specialization you are involved in?
So I guess it depends on how far back we want to go. Okay, so I guess when I was in like middle school and high school, I was probably like, at least in the US, like the stereotypical like suburban middle school, high school students, like spent my weekends like randomly walking around some mall with some friends or whatever. And I thought that was like a reasonable existence at the time. And then when my friends started getting their driver's licenses, I had one of my friends suggest that we ditch school one day and go for a hike. This was something I had no idea like really what that meant. Both my parents grew up in New York City, and they certainly, my mother were like, they were not like the nature inclined people. So this was new to me. So we drove to a pretty big park a little bit north of New York City and spent the day hiking. And like, I was like a kid in a candy shop. Like that was this totally new experience for me. And it just made me realize I had been like wasting all of my weekends before that wandering aimlessly through the through a mall, and that was like a pretty pivotal experience for me. And then after that, when I got my driver's license, I would pick up my friends and we would like go and explore the woods. And and my intention was to go to college, major in biology, and become a physical therapist. I had torn my ACL in my knee playing football when I was in high school, and I went to physical therapy for a while. and I thought that would be a really cool profession. But life has a way of taking you in a different trajectory. I got a job with those physical therapists, and they took me to like hike up mountains for my first time. So they kind of like helped facilitate that connection to nature in the woods. And then when I started college, I went to a public state school in upstate New York. And my first semester, I took an environmental studies class, not really knowing anything about what that was. And in that class, that was the first time I was ever really exposed in a meaningful way to all of the different ways that I guess like that people suffer at the hands of other people, and the ways that nature suffers at the hands of people. And that was like really eye-opening to me. And our lab sections for that class, we would go and wander through our nature preserve on campus and learn how to identify trees. And then through that experience, I like slowly began to realize like, oh, this is like a career. This is something that you can do for the rest of your life. And so for me, like that was like the hook. And then from that point on, I would just spend all of my afternoons in this nature reserve with a backpack full of field guides, trying to learn how to identify every plant and animal that I could find. And then I just like, I couldn't get enough. I took every type of ecology class that I could. And then it was either my junior or senior year when my botany professor taught an ethnobotany class, and I took that, and it just gave me new perspective on plants and the natural world, but it also provided me with an opportunity to like explore other aspects of the natural world that I hadn't yet. And so I guess through all those experiences and summer research opportunities, I like started to triangulate on what I wanted to do. And I guess ultimately the thing that hooked me, even though I spent time studying birds and other things, the thing that hooked me were trees and forests. And so yeah, then I figured out how to, I guess, make a career out of that so far anyway. Does that answer the question, Belkis?
Yes, I mean we can go over and over for like hours just describing philosophically how, scientifically why, and all of that, but this gives a nice summary. So, I mean, now if you have to describe the type of work you need, in your field, like you're focused on forest and management, I guess, and like how would you do? How is what's the nature of your work? Like, what are the big questions you're trying to solve through your research?
Yeah, so it depends on which sort of sphere we're looking at, but basically the way I come at this is my perspective on science, and this doesn't need to be everybody's perspective, but it's my perspective, that while I wish I was in some ways, except for like sexism and racism and classism associated with like science and everything else in society of the 1800s. Like in some ways I romanticize that era when being a scientist was just like characterizing and cataloging new plants and animals. And I, sometimes I wish like I could get a grant just to wander the woods and identify things and just learn about science and nature just for the sake of learning about science and nature. But I feel like now where we are is that there's so many massive and looming environmental and connected societal problems that as a scientist, I don't really feel like I have the luxury of studying science for the sake of studying science. So my research is then motivated in a way of like, how do I do scientific research that can maybe simultaneously advance our fundamental understanding of the natural world while trying to understand and potentially solve some environmental problems, right? So that's like at the foundation of how I approach things. And for me, the way I tackle this is largely through carbon cycling, because that is like such a critical component in the climate crisis that we face. And in my mind, what I keep reminding myself is globally, forests and other forms of vegetation, photosynthesis through those organisms offsets about a third of all of our fossil fuel emissions each year. But the capacity of those ecosystems to continue to perform that service is tightly coupled with what climate conditions and environmental conditions are like. And so while on one hand, we rely heavily on those systems to buy us time and slow the rate of climate change, as our climate continues to change, as we continue to change our landscapes, we're also impacting the capacity of those systems to perform that service. And so for me, the big overarching questions sort of are related to how are these changes altering carbon sequestration in ecosystems? What do we need to be able to quantify so that we can get enough of a mechanistic understanding that we can build that into models that are ultimately used to kind of connect climate change and the carbon cycle in a way that can inform policy. So that's like the big picture. In cities, what I try to understand is sort of like disparities between historically marginalized communities and access to green space, vegetation, and the ecosystem services they provide, particularly in the context of cooling cities off. In sort of like broader urban, suburbanized, what we call like human modified landscapes, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how forest fragmentation, which is pretty pervasive in these systems, how that is altering the way forests perform. For decades, there was a lot of literature about the negative impacts on biodiversity and not as much about other ecosystem functions or processes like water cycling and carbon cycling. And so over the last 7-8 years, there's been a lot more research in that realm, but I would argue that there's still a lot that we don't know, even though this is like the work that we do is in temperate forests, which is some of the most heavily studied forests in the world. So we try to better understand those dynamics and how land cover change and fragmentation interact with a changing climate to change what forests do. As a quick example, when you have an intact forest and you break it up into smaller pieces and the forest is now next to something that's not a forest, the forest on the edge is now hotter, it's drier, it's windier, it's exposed to more light. All these things, like they change the way the forest functions. And we had been, as a scientific community, ignoring that for quite some time, even though that's a pretty large proportion of the world's forest. So we try to understand that. And then in more rural areas, a lot of my work in those contexts are in northern landscapes where snow is a really important component of the ecosystem. And as our climate's warm in many northern areas, winters are warming considerably faster than the growing season, but most of our research studying the impacts of climate change has focused on the growing season. And so we've been doing different types of experiments where we can manipulate both winter climate and growing season climate in a forest setting to try and better understand like this big question of how do different aspects of climate change across seasons impact the way ecosystems function. So I don't know if anyone is still awake after all of that, but I don't know if that helps to answer the question, Belkis.
Before I took a class in ecology with you this year, I always thought, why don't we solve this problem by just planting trees? Like we get a lot of trees, let's say native trees that used to be here, and we plant thousands and thousands all over in the city, outside. For me, that was a simple way to fix it. But like, okay, I know approximately why we cannot do that, but like, I would like to get your perspective how this simplistic way of thinking is not maybe the solution.
Yeah, so there's been like some provocative work highlighting like if we plant like 1 trillion trees or whatever that number was, that we can make a serious dent into the climate problem. And I don't think like what I'm about to say is an argument against doing that. It's perhaps just more of a reality check for why that alone cannot solve our problem. Historically, about 20% of all of the carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere have come from clearing forests, right? So if we were to say, okay, we're going to reinstate or replant all of the original forests that were once there, we're really only looking at then removing about 20% of the CO2 that humans have put in the atmosphere. We still have to deal with that other 80%. The other part to this is in a lot of places where we don't have trees anymore, it's because we've replaced them with the homes where people live or the agricultural fields where we grow food to feed people. And so we sort of have these multiple competing interests for the same area of real estate. So while it seems nice and romantic, the idea that we can plant our way out of the climate problem or out of the biodiversity problem, there are these really serious logistical limitations to our capacity to do that. We have cities now globally that are using tree planting programs as sort of like a cornerstone of their broader sustainability strategies. Like in New York City, there's this really great ambitious goal of increasing tree canopy cover from 22% where it is now to 30% over the next 11 years or so. And it's because of this recognition of the important services that trees provide. But it's tricky to find all of the places where we can not just plant trees, but plant them in places where we're setting them up for success and have the resources in place where we can maintain the trees, right? Like places like Manhattan are on one end of the extreme. That's not always the ideal place for a tree to grow. But even in rural areas, you're talking about in a lot of places, this is private land ownership. And at least in the US, we can't force people to plant trees on their property. We can incentivize it, and sometimes that works. But like in the case of America, getting Americans to eat less beef. If we can eat less beef as a society, it frees up a whole lot of land to plant trees. But at the end of the day, there's all of these competing interest for the same piece of land, and it makes realizing that goal of sort of like reinstating all of the forests that we once had quite tricky.
So for instance, let's say we do have a small piece here, like in New York City, one of the places where like empty, we can use it, we can plant trees. Can we plant whatever type of tree we want, or what is the importance to maybe bring specific trees to the urban environment compared to the forest?
Yeah, so the most important thing is to plant a tree that will survive and then not start to invade other nearby natural areas if you're planting something that's not native, right? There's a big push to planting natives in cities, which I think is a great idea. And at the same time, what we need to be mindful of is that we're then expecting native tree species to perform well in a very non-native environment, right? Like our beautiful red oak trees, right? In a forest, these are some of the fastest growing trees that we have. They can get large, they sequester huge amounts of carbon, they support more biodiversity in our region than any other genus or species do. But will they evolve to be in a forest, not in like a city type environment? Will all of the oak species perform just as well in a tree pit or something like that? So we really need to think about like right tree, right environment. And there's not just the like one species that works everywhere. And I think in addition to that, we want to kind of emulate what nature does for us. Like generally diversity in a forest, just like maybe diversity in our human populations is a good thing and makes for a more resilient forest. Humans, we have this history of planting trees in cities almost entirely based on cultural preferences, which led to many temperate cities being dominated by Norway maple and London plane trees, right? But that just means that all of those trees are going to then be susceptible to the same type of stressors at the same time. And so now there's a new appreciation for planting things in cities that will do well in cities and that also are diverse. So you're not planting a more than, I think, what's the rule, like 20% or so of like the same, or 20 or 30% of the same genus. And so you want that diversity in species, and you want that diversity in the size and age structure, much in the way that you would want to have if you were managing a forest ecosystem. Belkis, you're muted.
I'm thinking. I'm saying, okay, so for instance, we have always an urban environment and we have a forest environment. Like, and I see a lot of your work, you try to, understand the difference between these two environments. So like, I never thought about urban as a important, like I always thought, oh, we can just fix the forest around us. It's not that important to plant trees back in the city. Like, what would this change, or what would this, it's just 1, 2 trees compared to the forest we have thousands. Like, what would that change if we plant stuff in the city?
Yeah,
How important, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the US, 80% of our population lives in cities. Globally, it's like 55%, 60%, something like that. So we're at a point in time, the first time in human history, where the majority of our population lives in cities. When we make cities, we clear vegetation and we put built infrastructure. When we do that, we're inadvertently increasing the temperature of our cities. So like, for example, New York City is about 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it would be if it were not a city, if it were still just a forest. In the US alone, somewhere between 3 and 6% of all of our electricity use is used just to offset that warming that we get in cities, right? So that there's an extra cooling cost of being in a city. And so there's a variety of different tools that are used to try and cool cities off. And one of them is to plant more trees. So the combination of shade and transpiration are really powerful tools for cooling things off. This is important both from an energy use perspective, but it's also a really important equity piece. It's oftentimes in our cities that it's lower income communities, communities of color, immigrant communities that are living in neighborhoods that have much less vegetation than more affluent communities. And that means that those communities are being disproportionately adversely impacted by things like heat waves. And they're also being disproportionately burdened by having to use air conditioning, which it can be tricky if you're already in a low income community. So we can use tree planting as one of many means to try and correct for in what's in our country been many, many decades of environmental injustice. There's also a lot of research that highlights the mental health and physical benefits of being able to even just see trees and green spaces out your window, right? So from a mental health, from a public health perspective, increasing canopy cover while numerically the number of trees will be small relative to the forest, the impact that they directly have on people is large because this is where most of our people live. And then the other component that I'll add is cities are where most people have their first encounters with nature. And if we can increase the accessibility to nature, then hopefully more broadly that inspires people to develop a little bit more of a connection with the natural world and thinking a little bit more about how the decisions that they make might impact the natural world, both immediately around them, but then more broadly beyond the city that they're living in. So I think that there's lots of reasons why we should think about planting trees in cities, even though globally it's only a few percent of our land area. It's also where the majority of our people live.
Thank you so much. So we have a question, but I will try to reform it, but please, whoever like ask the question, you can like intervene and correct me. So whatever, like if you just step aside from science and let's say we're talking to our community, to our friends around us, who wouldn't understand the complicated terms we might use. And they'd be like, oh, I mean, I have like a bunch of trees at home. I have a lot of maple or like, you know, whatever, like oak, sugar maple or red oak, any type of trees. And why don't I just plant them next? How would we how would we communicate with them in a way to explain that's not how we should do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we deal with this a lot in our work. So I've been working a lot with municipalities that are trying to develop tree ordinances, which are just pieces of legislation that govern how trees on public and private property kind of get maintained. Usually it places restrictions on people being able to cut trees down on their own property. And the communicating why does this matter is tricky sometimes. And then on the flip side of that, incentivizing people to plant trees and controlling what they plant can be tricky. And so I think like some arguments to be made is like, okay, so if that person knows that it's an oak or a maple, they know that it's a fairly large tree. There's places where planting that fairly large tree works out really well in your backyard, not right next to your home, in a park, things like that. But you might also want to think about the fact that when we plant a tree, if it's right next to a home or if it's right next to power lines, at some point that tree is going to achieve a size where it could potentially threaten a home or threaten power lines, and a municipality is likely to come through and cut that tree down. And so we want to think about not just simply planting trees, but thinking about the characteristics of a tree relative to where that thing is getting planted, right? And so if we just were to plant maples or oak trees everywhere, regardless of the circumstance, we would get a beautiful little mini urban suburban forest of oaks and maples, and then before long, we would have to start cutting them down because they were interfering with other forms of infrastructure that people deem as being important. In addition to that, another way to communicate this is just like there's we think about this a lot in the COVID era. People had different predispositions to suffering from COVID. You can have 10 people get it, and they can have 10 very different experiences that are largely born of something about like the genetic diversity across those people and some pre-existing conditions. One can make the argument that diversifying the trees that we plant in our landscape is important for similar ways, because if we have that diversity of trees, then any type of pathogen or pest that comes in at any one time is only likely to impact a small proportion of those trees instead of killing all of the trees at the same time.
For instance, okay, so what is the if anyone or any of us wants to, they want to contribute, instead of only telling them you shouldn't do that, is there like a resource or kind of a platform that someone can go to, and like from there they can pick which tree they can, like, kind of a reorganization of the
Yeah, so a lot of these, like, there's like a regionalization of all this, right? So the tree that would be the trees that would be right to plant in New York City would not be the trees that would be right to plant in Mexico City or in Phoenix, Arizona, or something like that. So in New York, our state environmental commission, the Department of Environmental Conservation, they've been putting together lists of things like climate resilient trees and trees appropriate for planting in urban landscapes. New York City comes up with a similar list. And so usually like bigger cities tend to have some lists, but also state, either like forestry or environmental entities usually come up with lists of appropriate trees to plant. I wish I had, I have this one slide that where there's an example of this. If you want, I can pull that up for what that looks like in New York City. Let me see if I can.
If anyone have a question, I can either write it down, or I can, if you don't feel comfortable talking, I can read it for you. So just take your time for the slide. If you have it now, we can wait for a minute.
You want me to share my screen real quick, and I can?
Yes. Okay. I think.
Yep. I'm good.
You can. Okay.
Okay, so like here's something that we would have for our region where we are in the New York City area, right? Like I think this was put together, this one was put together by the Arbor Day Foundation, but then the specific tree species would be different for different regions. But what we have here, this is what I was talking about before, where you might plant small trees by a power line. In our region, these could be things like a redbud, a flowering dogwood, a crabapple, a serviceberry, a pawpaw. And then depending on where else you're planting trees, you might have trees of different sizes, and depending on the purpose, you might have trees of different sizes. So there are these lists of these. This is a list of trees that I would typically recommend for municipalities in our region, depending on where you're planting things. These are things that a handful of these, or most of these, will do well in our climate now and in our climate 50 years from now, which is the other really important thing to think about. Is our climate's changing. And so we can't just plant trees that do well in what our climate's like right now. Trees live a long time, hopefully. And so you want to make sure you're planting trees that are still going to be able to perform ecosystem services 50 years from now in the same way that they are now. And so there's examples of this from states all over the country, and I would imagine other cities in other countries would have similar types of documentation available.
Perfect. Do you think that, before I go to the next question, do you think this is an area that is maybe students would be interested to, like, do we still have gaps we need to fill, like research wise?
Yeah, so cities are really interesting from a tree growth perspective. Like there's work that shows that trees in cities can actually grow considerably faster than the same species out in some rural forest. But some of our recent work also shows that while these trees during most years are growing faster, during abnormally hot years, they suffer a lot more than the same species would in a rural area. So there are like these interactions between urbanization and climate change that impact the way trees function and grow in ways that we couldn't predict just based on our understanding of these trees from a more rural context. And so I think trying to understand how the multitude of environmental stressors that exist in cities, things like pollution, the urban heat island effect, the air tends to be drier. Depending on where the tree is, drought could be more problematic, like in street tree pits, right? There's oftentimes less water available to them. Different forms of air pollution, which I mentioned, but also soil pollution. All of these things are impacting how a tree sort of experiences the world. And it also seems likely from our work that it also is impacting how a tree sort of like experiences climate stress. And we don't know the mechanisms behind that just yet, but we are seeing, especially like where we've looked at this in New York and in Boston, that trees in those cities under like sort of average climate conditions grow faster than their counterparts in a rural forest. But when we have years with like lots of heat waves, for example, their growth rates suffer a lot more than their rural counterparts. And so I think trying to understand how broadly urbanization is impacting the sort of physiology of trees and how they kind of experience the world. If we can better understand those mechanisms, then we can better develop what we call tree planting palettes. So like what's the palette of trees that we should draw from to repopulate the forest or the canopy of our cities. So I think those things are really important, those interactions.
Thank you. So we have a question from Alex. So they're saying, what role can green roofs play in all of this? Is the cost risk of putting extra weight and water on the roof worth it for the carbon capture, heat capture, air cleaning potential of green roofs?
Yeah. So I think the carbon component of green roofs is not the reason to plant a green roof. The amount of carbon that you could possibly capture in a green roof is going to be trivial. If you think about like most of that carbon is going to be in the plants, and the plants are like this big, right? There's not a ton of carbon being sequestered there, and they don't grow particularly fast, but they are useful in cooling things off. So green roofs and white roofs are great ways to help to mitigate the urban heat island effect. White roofs is simply just like painting roofs white, is actually really effective at cooling things off. And we can already see this in satellite imagery in New York City. New York City had an initiative about 14 years ago to incentivize planting roofs white because it's really cheap to do that. And we can already see the cooling benefits of that. You have to redo it because over time, especially in cities, what was nice and bright white gets dirty over time. You have to redo it. Green roofs can also be really important for cooling. And you're right. In some cases, you need to think about like the engineering of the structure of the building. Can it support a green roof? But one of the people that runs New York City's green roof program, he argues that most roofs can support some type of green roof. There's all different ways or forms of green roofs, and there's likely one that is suitable to almost every type of roof without having to re-engineer anything. So I would argue the role of a green roof is more in cooling, and if we do it right, in biodiversity. It's a great way to provide pollinator habitat, right? A lot of important pollinator plants are herbaceous plants that can do well in a green roof environment. And so I think those are the reasons to plant a green roof, not the carbon perspective.
I hope, thank you so much for the answer. So besides the urban, the question we have asked about the potential like research project, what are the other areas in your, let's say the hot topics that someone can get involved in right now in research, perspective?
We have a long history of studying impacts of like one aspect of environmental change on ecosystems, on tree physiology, plant physiology, things like that. But where we need a lot more research is experiments that look at multiple factors simultaneously and being able to tease apart the role of individual factors of environmental change and their collective impact. So like, for example, even just in climate change, you have all these studies where they would study the impacts of warming. But in addition to warming, we also have changes in drought and precipitation regimes. And so we're starting to see more and more experiments that are not just warming or not just altering precipitation, but trying to do both of those things simultaneously. So I think an exciting yet difficult sort of frontier in a lot of the science is like these interactive effects of different aspects of environmental change. And like I was talking about earlier, like we've been studying impacts of forest fragmentation, and in doing so, we learned that when you fragment a forest, those trees now respond to climate differently than when they were in the middle of an interior forest. And so we get these surprising discoveries that that we didn't know about and had no way to predict beforehand. And I think increasingly we find that when you put two things together, the response is not predictable from our understanding of any one of those alone.
From all of these perspective and research, I know that we have a lot of instruments you might use, to measure certain things. Can you give us examples of the instruments you might use to measure things? So, in the field.
Sure, yeah. So I know, Belkis, you asked if I was going to be in my lab today and I can show instruments, and unfortunately I'm not. But one of the, I guess, a common instrument we use is something called an infrared gas analyzer. And these are these cool instruments that shine a sort of a beam of infrared radiation through a stream of air, and it's able to detect the concentrations of carbon dioxide in that air. And the way that they work is carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas because it absorbs and re-radiates infrared radiation. So as air is moving through some tube, if you shine infrared radiation through it, and then you can measure how much is getting absorbed versus reflected, you can quantify the concentrations of CO2. And so we use that fundamental technology to do things like measure photosynthesis. So for example, we have an instrument that sort of looks like a robotic Pac-Man that we can kind of clamp down onto a leaf. And then the way this instrument works is that it puts, if my hand is like my little chamber here, it puts air in one side and we have our leaf inside. We do have a leaf. Perfect. Okay, this is the closest I can get. So we have our little leaf, we clamp down on it. We send air in on one side, and we know the amount of CO2 of the air going in, and then we measure the air coming out on the other side, and the difference in the CO2 concentrations between the air going in and the air coming out of our little chamber is the response to photosynthesis. So because photosynthesis actively removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, what's coming out should be lower than what's going in. And from that difference, then we can quantify rates of photosynthesis. So we can go up to the canopy of a tree, or we can like shoot a branch down and bring it into the lab and put our little instrument on it and measure rates of photosynthesis. So that's like a super useful tool. That little chamber inside of it, we can control light intensity, we can control temperature, we can control humidity. So we can conduct these little like mini experiments on like, one little leaf and better understand how leaves respond to a variety of different temperatures or light scenarios or levels of humidity or carbon dioxide concentrations. And then we can use that same sort of technology, but like housed in a different instrument to measure the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out of the soil. So broadly in an ecosystem, what governs how much carbon it sequesters is the difference between how much it takes up from photosynthesis and how much it releases from respiration. So like in the soils, there's all this organic matter that's being decomposed by invertebrates and microbes, and the roots themselves are respiring. And so we wind up measuring how much CO2 that produces. And so at the ecosystem scale, we can kind of like pair our measurements of photosynthesis of a leaf to respiration coming out of the soil or coming out of tree stems and get what we call a carbon balance, right? And we can figure out what's that difference between uptake and loss and better understand how environmental conditions are controlling those two processes. And then at like a bigger scale, we work with atmospheric scientists, and they put the same type of instrumentation up on these really tall towers. And you can have one tower situated just upwind of a city and another tower situated just downwind of a city. And you can look at the differences in CO2 concentration as the air is moving from one tower to the other. And as it's coming across the city, you would see CO2 concentrations increase because there's all these cars and local sources of emissions. And we can use those measurements to better understand how much CO2 is being emitted by our cities, and then also to develop tools to assess the extent to which our cities are meeting their objectives for reducing fossil fuel emissions. Like cities have, like in New York State, they want to be like net neutral or something by like 2050. But what we don't have is like tools to figure out if we're actually achieving that. And so using these sorts of technologies, we can help to get ourselves there. The last piece that I'll mention, since this is a plant group, is we insert these little metal probes into a tree stem, and it measures the rate of water movement through the tree. So we can better understand transpiration dynamics and water use characteristics of a tree in real time. And the way that these work is you sort of have these probes. There's 3 of them. I don't know how to get, maybe like this. There we go. We have our 3 probes, and this middle probe sends out these pulses of heat. And then these bottom probes are just measuring temperature. When the water is moving quickly, it's carrying that pulse of heat very quickly towards this top sensor. When the water is not moving quickly, the temperature of this sensor and the temperature of this sensor are going to be pretty similar. So based on temperature differences between our different sensors, we can then quantify how quickly water must have been moving to essentially move that to dissipate that amount of heat. And so these are just really exciting ways to see behaviorally how trees function, maybe during times of heat stress or during times of drought. How are their water use dynamics changing?
I mean, I remember before I joined your class, I thought the way we measure tree, diameter, or like, oh, the age of tree is like we cut the tree off and that's how we can know, like by, counting how many cycles. I didn't know that you have all of these new instruments. Have you not actually harm the tree to know what's the age?
Yeah, right. So I was just looking over here because I usually have, like, in the corner of this room a bunch of increment borers just sitting on the ground. But basically, like, to get at Belky's question, we want to know, like, we want to reconstruct how fast trees were growing over time and how old they are. Basically, what we use is a very like low-tech device called an increment borer, which is just like a hollow drill bit that we screw into a tree, and then it allows us to pull out sort of a straw size piece of wood from the tree, and then we can sand it and see all the rings. And then we use microscopes and different types of digital software to measure the distances between those rings. And then we can figure out any given year how fast did a tree grow, and we have different equations that we can apply that growth to see what that means in the whole tree scale for carbon sequestration. And these are some of the ways that we're able to better understand how trees and forests respond to different aspects of climate over time. Like, we don't have to wait for a climate event or a hot year to happen. We can take advantage of essentially all the data that the tree was storing in it. Like a tree is like the original thumb drive, right? It's like walking around. Well, they don't walk around, but they're sort of sitting in place with all this data stored in it. And then we use these increment borers to access those data.
I mean, it's always innovative on ways. Like, I think it's a constant moving feed with, inventing kind of instruments to measure things. If you have to describe, now we're going to the more general questions so we can end the meeting. If you have to describe your typical field research day, like how would it be? What would happen? So we can have a perspective to anyone who is interested.
Yeah, I don't know that there's ever a typical, right? Which I think is what makes it so much fun for me, is that I'm never doing the same thing over and over again. It depends on the project and the time of year. So like, okay, so last summer we started a new experiment in Massachusetts. We're measuring tree growth, we're measuring root growth, we're measuring soil respiration, all these different variables. And so like a combination of myself and students in my lab, one day each week we would be measuring one of these things. We have like these little bands that go around trees, and we would make weekly measurements of tree growth using those bands. And yeah, so there's no typical, but I would say that the one thing that is typical is troubleshooting, right? Like we have all these fancy instruments, but they inevitably fail for one reason or another, either because like we did something wrong or the instrument decided it didn't want to work that day. So there's a lot of troubleshooting involved. And then beyond that, though, I guess like, yeah, there's not a typical, depends on the day and the time of year.
If let's say, for instance, you just give us one of the most interesting, field trips that you had, maybe an incident or something, and maybe not the worst, but let's say not really convenient situation like field work type. Just one of the most interesting, maybe positive way, and so we can have an idea of how it can be fun or maybe hard to do the
Sure.
measurements.
Okay. All right. So here is one of my more exciting days. So for one of our projects that we did in the height of the pandemic is we were looking at how trees responded to a late spring frost that defoliated a lot of the trees. And so the way that we did that is we would make frequent measurements of photosynthesis of the leaves as they developed. And so I would go out to the forest with a colleague of mine. He would have a shotgun with him. We'd shoot down branches from the top of the canopy. The little branch would find its way down. Oftentimes it gets hung up on some other branch higher up, and so it can be like a time-consuming, tedious process. But inevitably, we get our little branch, we snip it in water, and then we put our little robotic Pac-Man thing on it to make our measurements of photosynthesis. And all in all, it takes us 4 or 5 hours to do this for like the 18 trees or whatever that we want to sample. And there was one particular day when, as we were doing this, a rattlesnake sort of slithered out and slithered over my backpack and just kind of like kept going on its way. So you always have like these fun, unexpected things. And yeah, so that I think that was probably one of my more exciting days. I feel like I guess another example is when I was doing my master's work in northern Maine. When we were looking for field sites. So when we're looking for field sites, we're looking for parts of the forest that exhibit like some sort of characteristic, and a characteristic that then we can replicate across our different sites. As we were walking around, I even though we're studying trees, I had a little baby moose start running over to me. And initially this like, oh, this is really exciting, a baby moose, except there was a part of me that switch went off, and it was like, oh, but that means mama moose is somewhere nearby, and I do not want to be anywhere near a 1,000-pound moose and its calf. So that initial like, oh, this is adorable, turned into like, we got to get the heck out of here soon. So there's when you're doing field work, there's like the thing that you study that you get to experience a lot, and then there's all the other things that exist in nature that you also get to learn about through sort of these anecdotal exposures.
So basically, the research in this field, the component of being outside is the highest. Like if you have 100% of your day, of your research, is like most of your time you're outside doing your research, right?
In the summers, yeah, we'll spend like 3+ days a week, full days out in the woods collecting stuff, whether it be soil samples or measuring some of these things on trees, like I had mentioned. Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of time outside. That's what drew me in.
Yes, that's what's exciting actually about this field, is being outside and how I can do science, I guess.
Yep.
So we can, finish and wrap it up. What would we, I will leave it freestyle for you. Either you finish with maybe an advice for anyone who is interested in this field, or maybe you want to share the good or the bad sides of the field, whatever you feel like would be a nice closing message.
Sure. And I noticed Alex had a question about
Yes.
photosynthesis and it not changing when you cut it off. So yeah, so we've done a lot of tests on this, and it varies by tree species, but generally if you snip it at the twig, the woody part, you usually have a couple of hours at least before you start to see any physiological change in what the leaf is doing. But when we sever the branch, we then quickly cut it in water to maintain that transpiration stream. So yeah, in our work and work lots of other people have done, it's pretty robust. And then I guess like my piece of advice is do the thing that you're excited and passionate about, right? Like I don't know, research in a lot of ways is like relationships with humans. You know, they will drive you crazy sometimes, and you'll want to just like ditch them and find some other experiment. But if at the core of it, you're pursuing something that you love and that you're passionate about, it'll be really easy for you to weather those frustrating times. And so, you know, when you are feeling frustrated, just take that step back and go and do what you need to remind yourself why you chose that particular field. Like that's what I do. When I'm getting frustrated, I go for a hike, and then I'm like, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing this for a living.
I mean, that's something we can apply in everything, I guess,
Yes,
including the scientific field. Thank you so much again, Andy, for your time. We
sure.
try to keep it 1 hour so no one, you know, go over the whatever you have in your schedule. Thank you again for everyone who attended the meeting, and I hope it's beneficial for the students who or whoever is interested in this field.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
Sorry for the last minute change in the time, but I'm glad you were able to make it. Hope it was worth your hour.
Thank you so much. I learned, even though I'm your student, I'm still learning from you.
Okay, great.
And one thing we're seeing is if there are less participants, there's more participation.
Oh, all right. Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Anyway, if any questions pop up that I didn't get to answer, Belkis can give you my email address. I'm more than happy to connect. But nice meeting you all.
Thank you,
Thank you again.